Sarah stood frozen before Jacob's grave, her hands trembling as if gripped by an invisible, icy force. The wind howled through the cemetery trees, carrying eerie whispers, but she paid no mind. Her eyes were locked onto the crumpled letter in her hands, Jacob's handwriting, jagged and uneven, seared into her memory.
Mom, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But I need you to do something.
1 year after my funeral, dig up my grave. The truth lies there. Trust me. I love you. Jacob. Each word cut into her chest like a blade, cold, sharp, and impossible to comprehend. Jacob had been dead for nearly a year. Sarah still remembered that day vividly, how she had placed a bouquet on his coffin, watched it descend into the dark earth. The sound of soil hitting would like the beat of a somber drum. She had wept until there were no tears left, had struggled to keep going despite the hollow ache in her heart. And yet, today, this letter had arrived. The envelope was torn and worn, the postmark smudged but dated just a week ago. A week? How could that be? Who had sent it? And why was it in Jacob's handwriting, the same shaky strokes, as though written in fear? She lifted her gaze, scanning the cemetery. The headstones stood in neat, pale rows under the blood-red sunset. The wind spiraled dead leaves into the air, as if unseen spirits lingered, watching, waiting. Sarah clenched the letter tighter, the paper scraping against her skin like fingernails on wood. Was this a cruel joke? A sick mind tormenting her? Or something far worse? She pictured Jacob, his pale face, his vacant eyes, standing somewhere in the shadows, silently begging her from beyond the grave. Sarah's heartbeat pounded in her ears, a deafening drum. He wants me to dig up his grave. Dig up his grave. The thought made her stomach twist, a cold fist tightening around her insides. It was unthinkable, a crime against the dead. But if this letter was real, if Jacob had known something before he died, what then? She thought of Jacob when he was alive, serious, sincere, never one to joke about something like this. And now, he was asking her to desecrate his own resting place. Sarah shoved the letter into her coat pocket, the paper crinkling against the fabric like a whisper of protest. She couldn't do this alone, she needed someone to anchor her, to stop her from spiraling into madness. With shaking fingers, she pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she landed on Daniel, her brother. The phone rang twice before his deep voice answered, "Hello?" "Daniel, I need your help," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "It's about Jacob." Silence. A long, suffocating silence. Then Daniel spoke, his voice cautious, concerned. "Sarah, you sound like you've seen a ghost." "I can't explain over the phone," she interrupted, her eyes still fixed on Jacob's headstone, his name carved into stone as if mocking her. "Please. Come to my house. Now. It's urgent." Daniel hesitated but finally agreed. Sarah ended the call, her breath curling into the cold air. She glanced at the grave one last time. For a fleeting second, she swore she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. Or was it just her imagination? A heavy weight settled over her, a dreadful certainty, a fragile hope. Something was waiting beneath the earth. Something that could change everything. And deep in her bones, she knew once she uncovered the truth, there would be no turning back. Night fell heavy like a damp shroud, smothering the cemetery in a suffocating silence. Sarah stood beside Jacob's grave, her breath escaping in white wisps, dissolving into the darkness. Daniel set the tools down quietly, a shovel, a crowbar, and a flashlight flickering weakly, as if gasping for life. "The sooner we finish, the better," Daniel murmured, his voice hoarse, half swallowed by the cold wind. He gripped the shovel and began to dig, the metal blade biting into the earth with a dry, hollow sound, like someone knocking from beneath. Sarah kept watch, her heart pounding. Every scrape of the shovel felt like a hammer blow against her ribs. The moon cast long, distorted shadows of the trees, twisting like skeletal arms reaching up from hell. Every rustling leaf, every shifting shadow made her jump, convinced that something or someone was watching. Jacob? Or something worse? Was she losing her mind? Digging up her own son's grave, an unspeakable, horrifying thought that clung to her like decay. The soil grew damp and black, exhaling the stench of rot. Sarah clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms until they drew blood, but she felt nothing. Only the cold, the kind that didn't come from the wind, but from deep within the earth itself, as though the grave was breathing. Daniel dug faster, sweat trickling down his temple despite the biting chill. And then, thud. He froze, eyes wide in the dim glow of the flashlight. "The coffin," he whispered, voice trembling. "I found it." Sarah swallowed hard, unable to speak. Daniel set the shovel aside, hands shaking as he grabbed the crowbar. He wedged it beneath the lid and pushed. The wood groaned, splintering like breaking bones. A foul mix of damp earth and something else, something sour and stale, seeped into the air. Sarah forced herself to look inside, her pulse hammering in her throat. The coffin was empty. No Jacob. No body. Only the white satin lining, crumpled and cold, lying still like a mocking grin. Sarah stumbled back, clutching her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, no, this can't be," she whispered, her voice breaking, shattering the suffocating silence. Daniel stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in his grip, casting erratic beams across his pale face. "Sarah, where is he?" His voice was barely audible. "Where the hell is Jacob?" She didn't answer. Her mind reeled, memories of the funeral flooding back. She had seen the coffin lowered, had heard the dirt fall, had felt the soul-crushing pain of losing Jacob forever. So what lay beneath them now? If not her son, then what? "The letter," she muttered, her fingers fumbling through her coat pocket. "Jacob said the truth was here, but what truth?" Her voice cracked into something between a whisper and a scream, but the cemetery remained silent, waiting for her to figure it out. Daniel knelt beside the coffin, his flashlight tracing over the satin lining. Then, he stopped. His fingers brushed against something small, tucked into the folds. "Sarah, look." He lifted a key, small, rusted, the numbers 247 crudely etched onto its surface. The light caught the metal, making it glint like the eye of something lurking in the dark. Sarah snatched it from him, the cold steel seeping into her skin. "What the hell is this?" she murmured, turning it over in her palm. "Who put it here?" "Someone wanted us to find it," Daniel said, his gaze locked onto the key, as if expecting it to move on its own. "But if Jacob's not here," his voice trailed off. "Who put this coffin in the ground?" Sarah didn't answer. She only stared at the black pit at her feet, where the empty coffin lay, a silent, taunting riddle. If Jacob wasn't dead, then where was he? And if he was, what had taken him? "We can't stay here," Daniel muttered, his voice tight. "If someone finds us like this," he didn't finish, but Sarah understood. They worked quickly, shoveling dirt back into the grave, every movement hurried, frantic, like burying a secret that should never have been unearthed. When it was done, Sarah clutched the key so tightly it felt like it was burning into her flesh. Jacob had left a trail, a cold, terrifying trail. And whatever the truth was, she knew it was waiting for her, hiding somewhere in the darkness. And it was watching. The key lay in the middle of the kitchen table like a living thing, catching the dim light from the overhead lamp and reflecting cold, flickering glimmers. Sarah sat there, turning it over in her fingers again and again, the number 247 engraved on its surface whispering to her an invitation from the dead. Across from her, Daniel sat hunched over, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, his fingers trembling around a cup of cold coffee. "It must open something," he murmured, his voice hoarse as if the darkness of the house had swallowed half of it.
A locker, a safe, but where? And whose? Sarah didn't answer right away.
Her mind spun with the image of the empty coffin, the crumpled white satin lining like the dried skin of a corpse.
If Jacob wasn't there, then where was he? And who had left the key, who had known she would dig up his grave?
I need to check Jacob's things, she whispered suddenly, standing up so quickly that her chair screeched against the floor.
There's something in his belongings. I just know it.
They descended into the basement, where the air was thick with cold and dampness, clinging to their skin like the breath of a ghost. Jacob's boxes sat stacked in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs, like small forgotten tombs. Sarah opened the first box, her hands trembling as she sifted through clothes, books, fragments of her son's life. Each item still carried the faint scent of him, though now it mingled with the stale odor of decay, as if time itself had rotted away the memories. Daniel rummaged through another box, his flashlight flickering, casting twisting shadows on the walls. Then he stopped abruptly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade.
Sarah, look at this.
He held up an old leather journal, its edges frayed and worn.
The initials J.T. Jacob Thompson were faintly embossed on the cover.
Sarah's heart pounded as she snatched it from his hands, fingers trailing over the cold leather.
She flipped it open, revealing yellowed pages scrawled with Jacob's handwriting. At first, the entries were normal dates, daily thoughts, random musings.
But as she flipped further, the writing became erratic, shaky, as if penned in fear.
And then, on the last page, she found it. Mom, if you're reading this, it means I've disappeared. But I'm not dead. I had to run. They're hunting me. If you find this, use the key. It's the only way to end this.
Sarah read the words aloud, her voice breaking, each syllable cutting into her like glass.
Daniel's face paled as he stared at the page. They?
Who the hell are they? He whispered.
What did Jacob get himself into?
Sarah flipped to the next page, but it was blank, as if Jacob's message had been severed before he could finish. She shut the journal, her hands shaking. We have to find out what this key unlocks, she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest.
If Jacob's still alive, I'm going to find him.
Daniel nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes, like he could already sense the darkness closing in around them.
The next morning, they began their search.
First, the bank where Jacob had held an account. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a forced smile, shook her head when she examined the key. It's not one of ours, she said, her tone as lifeless as the cold walls around them.
Our safety deposit keys are different.
And no, Mr. Thompson did not have a box here. Sarah bit her lip, disappointment curling around her like a freezing wind. They left the bank, the air outside feeling heavier than before, the sky an oppressive shade of gray. The train station, Sarah suddenly said, her eyes lighting up.
Jacob used to travel a lot. Maybe he left something there. It was a desperate hope, but it was all they had.
At the station, the attendant barely glanced at the key before shrugging.
We use electronic locks now, he muttered. But there are some old lockers in the basement. You can check there.
He pointed them toward the stairs, his voice indifferent, like he was sending them somewhere no one wanted to go. The basement of the train station was dark and damp, the scent of mildew thick in the air like the breath of a dying beast. Rows of rusted lockers stood in eerie silence, covered in dust and cobwebs, resembling a row of rotting teeth. Sarah scanned the numbers, her heartbeat pounding louder with each step until she stopped at locker 247.
She glanced at Daniel.
He nodded, gripping his flashlight tightly, its beam shaking slightly.
She inserted the key into the lock.
It stuck for a moment, then click.
A hollow snap, like the crack of brittle bone.
The door swung open. Inside was a plain envelope, lying there like a silent whisper. Sarah picked it up, hands trembling, and tore it open. A stack of papers spilled out photographs, bank statements, and a single handwritten note. She unfolded it and read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I never wanted to drag you into this, but I had no choice. The people I got involved with are dangerous. I faked my death to protect you, but I had to leave the truth behind. These documents explain everything. Be careful. They're still out there. And they'll do anything to bury this secret." Tears burned down Sarah's cheeks, hot against her cold skin. "He's alive," she breathed. "Jacob is alive." Daniel's grip tightened on the stack of papers, his face draining of color. The photographs showed Jacob with a group of men, hard faces, cold eyes like knives. The bank statements revealed massive sums of money moving through Jacob's account. But it was the final document that made Sarah's blood turn to ice, a contract, signed between Jacob and someone named Victor Crane. The name sat on the page like a curse. "Victor Crane," Daniel murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've heard that name before. He's a crime boss, drugs, smuggling. If Jacob got involved with him..." Sarah clenched her fists, nails digging into her palm. "We have to find Jacob," she said, her voice hard despite the fear curling inside her. "If he's in danger, I'm going to save him." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. But his expression darkened. "If Crane is involved," he said slowly, "this is bigger than we thought. We need to be careful." They gathered the documents and left the basement, but Sarah felt the chill from the envelope seep into her bones. Jacob was alive. But the darkness surrounding him was closing in, and now, it was coming for her too.